Imagine a scream so loud that it could rattle the windows of a barn on the far end of a wheat field, and imagine that scream coming not from a terrified farm animal, but from a furious suburban woman in beige yoga pants, standing on top of my fence waving an HOA rulebook, while yelling that my rooster alarm clocks and mooing cows were destroying her beauty sleep, and while she was screeching at me about noise violations and rural peace. My rooster Kenny crowed right in her face like he was defending his honor, which only made her shriek louder, as if the world was ending, and that was the exact moment I realized I had a neighbor who would do anything and everything to make my life miserable just to feed her ego and control the countryside that wasn't even hers, and I knew things were going to escalate the moment she threatened to drag the county wildlife department to my farm, even though I had every legal right to have livestock here long before she arrived with her fancy suburban house built right next to farmland and expected silence like a meditation retreat. So when she stomped away muttering that my animals would be gone in a week, I laughed a little too confidently, because I had no clue she had a secret, and that secret was going to turn this quiet little dispute into a full-blown war that would end with cops, cameras, officials, and a wildlife officer shutting down her illegal operation that nobody knew existed, not even me, the man whose land she had been spying on and complaining about every single morning, as if it were her personal mission in life to make sure my cows didn't moo and my goats didn't bleat and my horses didn't whinny after sunrise. And it all started when she and her husband bought the property next door, a property that used to belong to a sweet old couple who loved country life, but sold it for retirement somewhere peaceful, ironically, so this city queen named Karen could move in with the expectation of changing the entire countryside into some polished theme park version of farmland, because she couldn't handle dirt, hay smells, and animal noises, but she still wanted Instagram photos pretending she was living the ranch life. Yet the first week she moved in, she demanded I put shock collars on my goats so they would stop making noise when hungry, and I refused, which flipped a switch in her, and she told me something like, "This will not end well for you and your noisy zoo," and I told her that these are not zoo animals, they are livestock, and this is a farm, not a spa resort. But she never listened, and every day she would march angrily to the fence to lecture me about noise. Then her complaints went beyond insane when she started taking videos of my rooster crowing as if it were a crime and reporting it to the HOA, even though I was not in the HOA, and she kept filing complaint after complaint to the county, which laughed her off every time, telling her it's normal for animals to make noise on farmland. But she didn't give up. She started trying to bribe my mailman to leave noise violation letters that looked official but clearly weren't. Then she pretended to bring cupcakes to apologize but hid a noise complaint form under the plate, thinking I'd sign something without reading. But here's the funniest and strangest twist: while she was spending every ounce of energy attacking my perfectly legal animals, there were weird noises coming from her backyard at night, sounds I had never heard before. Screeches, growls, chattering, wild, frantic calls like jungle creatures with hunger in their voices. I asked my friend Earl if I was crazy, and he leaned in listening and whispered, "That doesn't sound like squirrels to me, buddy." And one night everything changed when I saw a long striped tail hanging out of her backyard shed like a raccoon, but bigger, way bigger, and it swished violently before disappearing inside, and I stood there frozen, because that tail didn't belong to any animal legally owned in this state. And suddenly her obsession with silencing my farm animals made sense, because she was hiding something loud enough to expose her, and I wasn't the only one noticing delivery vans late at night bringing crates with ventilation holes and exotic-sounding noises echoing from inside, and I suspected she was operating some kind of secret pet collection. And the real kicker was that she had installed tall privacy fencing thicker than a prison wall right after moving in, which I originally thought was just her being antisocial, but now it looked more like she was hiding an entire illegal backyard zoo. And if that was true, then the woman screaming that my chickens were ruining her peace was actually hosting dangerous wildlife 10 yards behind her house, and based on the beastly roars coming from her yard, she was about to mess with the wrong person, because in the morning after she called the sheriff claiming my rooster was attacking her property through sound waves, she made one huge mistake. She left a cage uncovered in the sun, and one of her creatures let out the loudest roar I had ever heard, and the entire neighborhood woke up, including the county wildlife officer, who happened to be driving by, and that roar started the downfall that would end with Karen screaming again, but this time begging officials not to take away her exotic animals, and nothing brings more satisfaction than watching Karma trot into someone's illegal zoo wearing a shiny badge and a wildlife patch ready to shut down their hypocrisy once and for all. The next day began with the chaos only Karen could create, because before the sun had even decided to rise she was banging on my door like she was raiding a crime syndicate, demanding that I do something about Kenny the rooster, who had dared to start his morning song at 5:23 a.m., as if I could negotiate natural animal instincts with a bird whose entire life purpose was to announce daylight before daylight existed, and she ranted that if she couldn't sleep then nobody should sleep, and as she turned around her backyard made a noise that sounded like a mini dinosaur had just woken up, which made her flinch and hurry back like she was afraid someone else would notice, and that sudden fear in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't trying to silence my farm, she was trying to hide hers, and the irony could power 1,000 windmills, because she kept preaching about noise laws while nurturing a backyard full of banned wildlife that clearly did not belong anywhere near family neighborhoods. And later that afternoon Earl came by with his binoculars and a bag of popcorn like he was prepared for a safari, and when we peeked over the fence just enough to see without getting spotted, we saw cages stacked on top of each other with claws and fur pushing between the bars, and Karen running around frantically trying to hush the animals with treats like she was bribing Chaos into behaving. But Chaos had other plans, and just as she closed one gate a monkey-like creature leapt onto her shoulder, making her spin around and scream silently with panic, and Earl almost choked on his popcorn, because we realized this was no petting zoo dream, this was a full-blown illegal exotic animal collection, and Karen, the queen of quiet, was harboring creatures that were louder than my entire farm combined. And as we watched, she dragged a metal tray filled with raw meat into the shed, and two glowing eyes emerged in the shadows, and I felt a cold shiver, because those eyes were predator eyes, and not the kind found in legal ownership lists, and that's when I knew what she had done. She had built a backyard zoo filled with dangerous species, most likely purchased through shady channels, and as we were connecting the dots, she spotted us, and yelled, "What are you looking at? Mind your own business, or I will call the police." And Earl shouted back, "Go ahead, call them, they will love seeing your illegal zoo," and she froze like her soul just left her body, but quickly regained her Karen energy, pointing her perfectly manicured finger and yelling that her animals were therapy animals for her emotional stability, and each one had a medical purpose, which was the dumbest lie ever told, because nobody needs a tiger for emotional comfort unless the emotional comfort is making other people terrified. And I told her she had one chance to shut up and mind her business, because she had more violations on her property than an entire circus company, but she laughed arrogantly, saying wildlife officers don't care about people like her, only about farms like yours. And then she stormed back inside believing she was invincible, and that was the moment she lost, because she didn't see the county wildlife truck pull into the road behind her house. Someone else had reported her, probably one of the delivery drivers. She stiffed on payment, and the officer stepped out wearing a confident look of someone who had seen every illegal animal operation in the county and was ready to shut down another. And Karen came out pretending to be the sweetest animal lover, offering fake smiles, but the wildlife officer was not fooled, and he immediately asked for permits while the creatures behind her began making enough noise to ruin her lies. And Earl whispered, "This is better than movie night," because as the officer demanded access, she tried to argue about privacy laws, but her own monkey escaped and ran across the yard screeching like a siren, and that was the end of her denial, because the officer pushed past her, and as he opened the shed we heard him say, "Oh, this is bad, very, very bad," and Karen burst into tears claiming she was rescuing these poor animals from bad people, but the officer explained she was the bad people because none of these animals were allowed, and she had zero training or facility safety approvals, and as cages were opened to check conditions we saw creatures that belonged in jungles, not backyards, and the officer called for backup, and animal control vans rolled in with tranquilizer teams ready to handle whatever came charging out because apparently she had a large cat, a boomslang snake, several exotic birds, and at least 2 small primates, and while she was begging them to let her keep her precious family they were busy reading her every violation in the book, and for the first time ever she was speechless while the animals she hid made more noise in 1 hour than all my farm animals made in a year, and as they loaded her illegal zoo into state trucks she watched her empire crumble, and I stood there realizing that karma is loud, very loud, and it always arrives right on time. The aftermath of the wildlife officer's visit didn't bring peace to the neighborhood like one might expect after a secret backyard jungle got busted because Karen's fury burned hotter than the midday sun on a tin roof, and instead of accepting the consequences of her illegal actions, she decided to double down and blame me for everything, claiming I had set her up, planted the animals, and convinced the officers that she was running a zoo when in her twisted imagination she believed she was rescuing exotic creatures and giving them a loving home, even though her idea of love looked more like chaos, cages, and fear. And the very next morning, as I was trying to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee with my rooster Kenny perched proudly beside me, Karen stormed over wearing oversized sunglasses and a fake neck brace, as if she had survived a wild animal attack in her own backyard, and she threatened to sue me for emotional distress, property damages, and animal theft, insisting that the officers only took her animals away because of my jealous snitching, and that I wanted her life, which made Earl spit out his drink laughing, because wanting her life meant wanting HOA fines, ridiculous lawn decorations, and constant shrieking tantrums which nobody in a 5-mile radius envied, but Karen kept ranting that she would get revenge by making sure my farm was torn apart by authorities, and she swore on her perfectly painted nails that she would prove my animals were the real problem, and for once I didn't laugh. Because she said it with that look in her eyes like she was about to commit a new level of insanity that none of us had ever seen, and Earl suggested we keep watch because Karen's anger combined with free time could be more dangerous than any tiger in her shed, so we started noticing that she was lurking around at weird hours, sometimes recording videos of my animals from the bushes or throwing little objects near the fence to startle the goats, and once we caught her playing rooster crowing sounds from a speaker near the fence at night, trying to get Kenny blamed for noise complaints, and when that failed she threw a tantrum so loud that even the cows turned to look like they were silently judging her decisions. But the strangest twist came 3 days later, when the wildlife officers returned not to take anything from me, but to deliver a letter saying Karen had filed a formal complaint claiming my animals were mistreated and endangered the community, so the county had to investigate, and while I was annoyed I cooperated fully, showing them every healthy animal, every clean habitat, and every legal permit, and they praised my farm, saying it was textbook perfect, while Karen watched from her window snacking on ice cream like she was waiting for my downfall to unfold, and when it didn't she slammed her blinds with rage that echoed across the field louder than my donkey Larry could ever bray, and I thought maybe that would finally stop her. But oh no, this woman had a bottomless pit of delusion to draw from, and later that same night Earl and I heard movement near the barn, and when we went to check we found the fence had been cut from her side, and a small speaker was hidden behind a bush playing non-stop loud animal cries that sounded like banshees, and Karen had set the volume so high that the sound bounced across the valley, making it seem like my animals were having a meltdown, and I unplugged the thing, furious at how far she was willing to go to frame us, and we decided to install cameras because clearly Karen had no respect for rules or logic, so a few cameras pointed at the fence seemed like a smart defense for whatever she had planned next, and the footage was gold. Within 2 nights we caught her sneaking up with a bag of what looked like fireworks. She tried lighting them near the barn, but the fuse died, and she stomped it with frustration. Then she picked up her phone and yelled something like, "If I can't sleep, nobody sleep," as if that was a reasonable motto for life, and when she realized she was on camera she gave the cameras a dramatic gasp, clutching her chest like the villain in a soap opera caught committing the most obvious crime in history, and she ran back inside, leaving the bag behind, and you would think she'd quit there, but instead she escalated her mission by filing noise complaints daily like it was her new hobby, and calling animal control every time a cow mooed or a goat sneezed, and the officers would arrive and see my animals eating happily or napping peacefully, and they started rolling their eyes whenever her address appeared in the system. But Karen wasn't just tormenting me, she began spreading rumors around the neighborhood claiming my farm was breeding diseased livestock, and that children should never walk past my property or they would catch dangerous infections, and soon a few nervous families began whispering, too afraid to ask me directly, but believing the lies she spread like weed. And Earl said we needed to crush her. Nonsense, before she turned the whole community against me. So we decided it was time to reveal the truth about Karen and her illegal exotic zoo, but I wanted to do it the right way with undeniable proof, so we contacted the wildlife officer, who had shut down her backyard zoo, and he agreed to come by and provide an official statement clearing my name and debunking Karen's lies. And when Karen saw the officer on my property again, she stomped over, demanding to know why her animals were not returned, yet claiming they were emotional support creatures, and the officer explained again that wild predators do not qualify as emotional support no matter how many therapy certificates she prints on her home printer. But she didn't listen, she only grew louder, yelling about her rights and her freedom, and how she would make sure my animals were evicted from this planet if she had to sue the entire universe. And while she screamed, the officer informed her that she was under ongoing investigation for illegal wildlife trafficking and could face fines and possible jail time if she kept interfering with official operations. And Karen went silent for the first time since moving in, and we all watched her storm away, but as she looked back her eyes promised one thing: she wasn't finished, not even close. And Earl sighed, knowing the storm had only paused, not passed, because Karen was planning something big, something dramatic, something fueled by pure chaotic Karen energy, and I knew that whatever came next would bring the biggest confrontation yet, and all we could do was prepare for the loudest battle this quiet countryside had ever seen. Karen's silence did not mean peace, it meant she was plotting, and Earl, who had dealt with her unhinged antics longer than I had because he lived next to her before she discovered the thrill of ruining livestock owners, warned me that a quiet Karen was like a storm forming beyond the hills, brewing destruction and screaming chaos, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. So I began preparing for anything and everything she might try, but I was not prepared for what she actually did, because instead of sneaking around like before, she went big enough to get the entire community involved, and she did it by calling for an emergency HOA town meeting in the middle of the week. And even though I was not part of the HOA, she insisted the meeting was required to discuss a noise threat to the tranquility and mental wellness of the neighborhood, which was code for ban that farm. And when the HOA president called me, saying it was only fair to hear her concerns, I knew this was going to be one of those nights where losing brain cells was guaranteed. So I showed up to the community center, and the place was packed full of neighbors whispering and staring at me like I brought angry tigers instead of cows, which was hilarious given that Karen was the one who actually had loud, dangerous animals. But she had already begun her performance, standing at the podium with giant posters showing dramatic images of farm animals with red warning symbols all over them, as if my goats were nuclear weapons. And she talked in a trembling voice about how the constant loud noises from my animals were destroying her sleep, causing migraines, and making her emotional support kitty anxious. And she added some fake tears, saying the farm environment triggers her past trauma and spiritual imbalance, which made Earl snort so loud that half the room turned to glare at him. But Karen continued her rant, describing my rooster Kenny as a vicious noise terrorist, orchestrating daily sonic attacks that shattered the peace of her pure soul, and she demanded the HOA take immediate action to force me to remove all animals within 7 days or fine me $5,000 per day. And when she finished, she looked at me with a smug smile like she had already won the battle and expected applause. But the room fell awkwardly silent, because even the most impressionable neighbors knew she had taken things too far. Then it was my turn to speak, and before I could even begin, Earl stood up and pulled down one of Karen's ridiculous posters and shouted, "You want to talk about loud, dangerous animals? How about the tiger you had behind your house, and the monkey that climbed your head like it was a jungle gym?" And the entire room gasped, because many neighbors had no clue she was the one who got busted by wildlife officers, and Karen's face turned whiter than powdered flour as the HOA president asked her if there was any truth to Earl's accusation, and Karen immediately launched into a denial, saying she only had therapy animals which were legal and quiet and very well behaved, right as the wildlife officer himself walked through the door to join the meeting, since the HOA president had invited him to provide clarity on the matter, and Karen's soul basically evaporated when she saw his badge, and he introduced himself, calmly explaining that several illegal exotic animals had been seized from Karen's property for the safety of the community, and that none of those animals belonged anywhere near residential housing. And he made it clear that I was fully compliant with all county farm regulations and noise expectations, and my animals posed absolutely no risk to anyone, and the entire room started murmuring, because suddenly the rumors Karen had spread about diseased livestock and dangerous farm conditions began to crumble like sandcastles in the rain, and she tried screaming over the officer, yelling, "He's lying, they are framing me, they want to ruin my life," but nobody was buying it anymore, especially when the officer mentioned the ongoing legal investigation and potential charges she could face, and someone in the audience asked if she would be allowed to keep any animals at all, and he replied, "None more dangerous than a goldfish," which made a few people laugh, and Karen stomped her feet, shrieking that she was being bullied by ignorant farmers and corrupt officials, which only made her look even more unhinged, until the HOA president finally banged the gavel and declared the meeting over, while also stating clearly that any complaints about legal farm operations would no longer be entertained, and as people left, several actually came up to me apologizing for believing her nonsense, offering to buy fresh eggs or cow manure for garden fertilizer, which felt like justice served on a silver platter. But the victory celebration didn't last long, because as soon as we stepped outside, Karen came running after us, screaming that she would get her animals back and expose the conspiracy against her, and she promised that my farm would fall before her righteous rage. And while her threats sounded like a mix of bad movie villain lines and a toddler meltdown, I couldn't help but feel uneasy, because Karen was beyond logic, beyond rules, beyond sanity, and desperate people often do the stupidest things. And Earl whispered, "We keep watch tonight, buddy. I have a feeling she's nowhere close to done." And he was right, because later that night, while the moon was bright and the world was quiet except for the gentle sounds of my animals living their peaceful, normal life, we saw a shadow moving along the fence line, and at first we thought it was just a stray dog, until the figure tripped over a bucket and cursed loudly in a voice way too familiar, and Earl flicked on his flashlight, and there she was, Karen, covered in dark clothing, carrying some kind of bag, and holding bolt cutters like she was preparing to break in and release my animals to cause havoc so she could call authorities and blame me for not controlling them. And when she saw the light, she froze, but instead of running, she hurled a handful of lettuce at us like she was feeding zoo animals, yelling, "See, I take better care of them than you." And we stood there speechless, because it was just pure unfiltered insanity at its peak. And Earl yelled, "Are you out of your mind again?" And she screamed back, "You can't stop me, the world needs saving from loud farms." And she tried to dash toward the barn, but Earl stepped forward, and so did my donkey Larry, who brayed loudly, startling her enough that she dropped the bolt cutters and fell backward, landing straight into a pile of fresh cow poop, which is probably the closest thing to karma taking physical shape. And she scrambled up, smelling like vengeance mixed with barnyard perfume, and sprinted back home, yelling, "You haven't seen the last of me." And as she disappeared into the night, Earl said something that made me laugh, even though the situation was insane. "Buddy, we need more cameras, because this is just level 1 boss fight, and the final battle is coming." And I knew he was right. Things were only going to get wilder and louder from here. By the morning after Karen's midnight poop dive adventure, the entire farm smelled fresher than she did, but the real stink was her rage, because she woke up determined to prove me and Earl were the villains of her life story, and she launched her next plan with a vengeance that made every hair on my neck stand up. Even the rooster Kenny seemed extra alert, flapping and pacing like he sensed incoming insanity, and sure enough, Karen appeared on her back porch with a megaphone strapped to her face, practically screaming "Good morning countryside, prepare to meet justice, because today is the day these unlawful farm animals are silenced forever." And Earl, who had stayed over to prevent any more sabotage, almost spit out his coffee because the megaphone was louder than every moo, cluck, and neigh combined, and instantly shattered the peaceful sunrise, while Karen yelled that she was drafting a town-wide petition demanding the farm shut down, and she would be collecting signatures door to door until she had enough support to force the county into action. And before Earl or I could say anything, she marched away with a determined stride, holding a clipboard and a stack of papers probably filled with lies and dramatic nonsense about rooster terrorism and goat warfare, and we spent the next hour debating whether anyone in their right mind would support her, until she came sprinting by again with her hair flying everywhere, screaming, "This neighborhood is full of traitors and idiots," because apparently most people told her to go home and stop embarrassing herself, but instead of giving up she tried a different tactic. She went online and posted dramatic videos claiming she was a victim living next to a monster who kept hundreds of loud animals that screamed at night and terrorized the local children, and she used footage she had secretly recorded of my animals but edited the audio to sound like a zoo riot, making it look like my cows were roaring like lions and my ducks were screaming like banshees. She even wore a neck brace and wiped fake tears, saying, "I need your help. The animals never stop. The farmer is punishing me for telling the truth, and he has threatened my emotional support, Kitty. I fear for my life." And somehow her video went viral in the angriest local Facebook groups filled with people who never checked facts, and suddenly she had more followers cheering her on than flies on fresh manure, and that gave her confidence. Dangerous confidence, because the next thing she did made even wildlife officers shake their heads. She called a sensationalist news crew who loved petty neighborhood drama more than real reporting, and by noon a van rolled up with cameras and a blonde reporter acting like she was investigating a global crisis instead of a rooster who crowed normally, and Karen welcomed them, dramatically showing them recorded rooster noises on her phone, which she clearly edited to sound like a horror movie jump scare, then pointing at my barn saying, "That is where the noise criminals are held hostage against their will," and she threw her arm around the reporter, whispering, "They are planning to escape and attack the community any day now." And while I thought the reporter would laugh, she instead nodded seriously, ready to film a segment on what she called farm noise terrorism. But before they could step foot onto my property, the wildlife officer, who seemed to have Karen on weekly surveillance, showed up again and shut the nonsense down, telling the camera crew they were being manipulated by a woman currently under investigation for wildlife crimes. And when the reporter tried to argue that her audience demanded the truth, he replied, "The truth is your story is backwards, because this farm is legal and quiet, and the only threat around here comes from that woman and her megaphone," which caught the attention of more neighbors who came outside watching the show. And Karen, not used to being publicly called out, began screaming again, accusing the officer of corruption, accusing me of bribery, and accusing Earl of being an accomplice to agricultural terrorism, a term so ridiculous that Larry the donkey brayed, as if laughing with us. But then Karen crossed a line. She pointed at my animals and yelled, "I will personally release these poor creatures from this prison if I have to cut every fence on this property," and that threat made the officer step forward, firmly instructing her to return inside and stop making threats or she would face arrest. And Karen, who never believed consequences applied to her, screamed, "Fine, arrest me. The world will see how you silence heroes, and villains like him keep running free," pointing her finger at me like she was a cartoon prosecutor. And the officer calmly said okay, and turned her around, placing her in handcuffs, which shocked the entire neighborhood because Karen finally realized she was not untouchable anymore. And while she kicked her feet and yelled, "Let go of me, you brute," she managed to step directly into another pile of cow poop and slipped again, falling face first, which made the reporter quietly pack up, because even they knew this was not the story they wanted anymore. And as Karen was escorted to the patrol car, she shouted every kind of threat possible. "I will sue you all. I will take down this dirty whispering farm. I will expose the noise demons you hide here. You cannot silence the voice of truth." But her voice was very literally being silenced as the patrol car door slammed shut and Earl looked at me with a most satisfied grin saying, "Well buddy, she finally mooed the wrong cow, now she gets to crow behind bars," and we thought after her shocking arrest maybe, just maybe, things would calm down at least for a few days, but peace is not something Karen believes in, and that evening, while I was feeding the horses, the wildlife officer returned not to check on the farm, but to warn me that Karen had been released pending investigation, and she left the station screaming that she was going to finish what she started, which meant she was already planning her next attack, and the officer told me to keep cameras rolling and stay alert because this situation was becoming more than just a noisy complaint war. It was escalating into harassment and attempted sabotage of agricultural property, and she might be facing criminal charges if she continued, but as long as she was free we had to assume she would continue, which meant the next round in this absurd battle between farm animals and backyard zoo queen was coming soon, louder, crazier, and probably involving something that would make even Kenny the rooster rethink his life choices. And as the sun set, Earl sighed, already exhausted, saying, "This is going to be a showdown of lunacy versus livestock, and Karen never fights fair. Get ready, because she is coming back with the fury of 1,000 Karens." And I nodded, knowing that the quiet of tonight was nothing more than the calm before the loudest storm this farm had ever seen. The day after Karen was released from custody started like any normal farm morning, with Kenny crowing, the sun awake, the cows stretching their legs, and the horses waiting for breakfast. But in the back of my mind there was a countdown ticking, because I knew the moment Karen opened her eyes, she would rise like an angry phoenix, ready to unleash chaos once more. And Earl, who stayed over again, sat on the porch sipping coffee, while scanning the tree line like a neighborhood security guard, except the enemy he was looking for wore leopard print pajamas and carried a megaphone, and it didn't take long before Karen made her appearance, stomping into her backyard with a giant speaker mounted on a pole, and she yelled, "I hope you are ready to taste your own noise, because this speaker is set to blast 150 decibels of peaceful whale noises until you learn a lesson." Except the noise she played was not peaceful at all. It was some screeching disaster that sounded like dolphins being chased by chainsaws, and my animals all looked up offended while Earl face-bombed so hard it echoed louder than her sound system, and I walked to the fence, asking her what in the world she thought she was doing, and she shouted, "Noise for noise, baby, you started this war, and I will finish it." And then she pressed play again, as if that screeching torture was her ultimate weapon in the noise war. But karma has a funny way of timing its punchlines, because just as she celebrated drowning out the roosters, the speaker sparked and exploded with a puff of smoke, forcing her to dive and roll dramatically like she thought she was in an action movie, and we laughed harder than we should have. But Karen did not find it funny. She jumped up covered in grass, yelling, "This is not over, I have more power than you can imagine," and she stormed back inside, slamming her door so aggressively that her garden gnome fell over, looking just as exhausted as the rest of us. And Earl shook his head, saying, "I don't like when the villain monologues about power. That usually means a boss battle is coming." And he was right, because at noon we heard the rumbling of engines, multiple engines, and when we stepped outside we saw a convoy of animal control trucks headed straight for my property, followed by a news drone buzzing overhead like a mechanical mosquito. Karen came running out waving papers, shouting, "I have undeniable evidence that this farm is an illegal breeding ground for dangerous hybrid animals," and she pointed toward me proudly like she had discovered the world's biggest scandal. And the lead animal control officer approached me holding a report that looked suspiciously like it had been glued together with glitter, asking if I was housing genetically modified animals, and I stared at him for a full 5 seconds trying to decide if he was serious, because the only thing genetically modified here was Karen's imagination, and after a quick inspection that showed nothing but perfectly normal cows, chickens, and goats, the officers apologized and left with Karen screaming, "Come back, they are hiding the mutants somewhere underground." And Earl muttered, "She has officially lost the last brain cell she had left." But Karen was only getting started, because later she returned wearing a fake wildlife badge she printed at home, holding tranquilizer darts, but they were clearly just colorful plastic straws, and she yelled, "By the power invested in me by the Endangered Creatures Alliance, I am seizing your rooster for further investigation." And she tried to grab Kenny, who pecked her on the hand, forcing her to run away, flapping her arms like she was escaping a rabid eagle, and while Earl and I were laughing too hard to breathe, Karen limped home clutching her hand like she just survived a battlefield. Then somehow she re-emerged minutes later with a ladder slung over her shoulder, muttering that if the authorities wouldn't listen she would expose my crimes herself from above, and she set the ladder against my fence and climbed like a raccoon with revenge, but halfway up the ladder legs sank into the soft dirt, and the entire thing tipped, sending her flying straight into her koi pond, soaking her from head to toe, and the koi scattered like soldiers fleeing their general, and she popped out yelling, "My fish have anxiety because of your evil rooster." The drama was exhausting, but the night that followed made everything before feel like a warm-up, because Karen wasn't just plotting to bother us anymore, she was planning sabotage. And around midnight, we heard strange clanking near the barn, and through the security cameras we saw her sneaking with a large sack and a container, and Earl whispered, "If she releases skunks again, I am moving to space." And when we zoomed the camera we realized she was carrying raw meat and trying to scatter it near the fence on my side, possibly to attract coyotes or mountain lions, thinking they would take care of my animals for her, and that crossed the line, so we called the wildlife officer, who arrived quickly, catching her red-handed, and when the officer yelled Karen stop, she dropped the meat, stumbled backward, and stepped directly onto an electric fence wire that was low to keep small predators out, and she screamed like a banshee, shot into the air for a split second, then fell into the grass twitching, and the officer sighed like he had aged 10 years in one moment, and said, "Karen, this has to stop. You are on the verge of criminal animal endangerment charges," and she moaned dramatically, saying, "You all just want me gone because I am strong and brave," and Earl whispered more like stupid and loud, and even the officer cracked a smile before sternly warning her that if she trespassed again she would face serious punishment and possibly jail time. And as she crawled away, still smoking from the electric fence, Earl looked at me and said one thing that stuck to my brain, "Buddy, this woman would fight a tornado if it blew too loud near her yard. We need a plan, a final showdown, something that ends this once and for all, because she is never going to stop unless the universe physically sits her down and forces her to chill." And I nodded, because he was right. Karen was escalating, and soon the stakes would be higher than goat pranks and broken speakers. And as the night grew still, Ella, one of my horses, nudged me like she felt danger still nearby, and I looked at my farm, quiet now, but I could feel thunder in the air, not real thunder, but Karen thunder, unpredictable, irrational, and coming soon, louder than ever, and this time she wouldn't be stopped by warnings, cameras, or electric fences. The final craziness was loading, and there was no telling what she would unleash next, and Earl said we better be ready for anything because this war is far from over, and if she gets one more idea from those Facebook groups we might all need helmets and panic buttons. The next morning arrived with a stillness so suspicious that even Kenny crowed quieter, like he didn't want to give away our location, because after Karen's electrifying midnight fiasco we all expected her to come roaring back before breakfast, and Earl said, if she's quiet it means she's crafting a disaster blueprint with crayons and conspiracy theories. And sure enough, around 10 a.m. we heard the sound of a truck that definitely did not belong in a peaceful countryside, because that engine roared like a dragon with a muffler problem, and when the dust settled we saw Karen riding proudly in the passenger seat of a huge animal rights protest truck painted neon orange with banners saying "Free the tortured animals" and "Justice for noisy creatures," and there were at least a dozen people jumping off with megaphones holding signs that said "Shut down this animal dungeon" and "Ban the rooster from hell," and Earl looked like he might actually faint from disbelief, because this woman had just imported a small army of activists who probably had no clue they were being used as pawns in her vendetta, but they were already chanting shut it down," while one woman with purple hair hugged my goat Daisy, saying "Your suffering is over, sweet baby," and Daisy, who only suffers when carrots are late, looked totally confused chewing hay, while receiving so much unwanted affection. Then a man dressed like a superhero with a cape that said Captain Animal Freedom charged forward, demanding that I release all farm animals to roam free as nature intended, and I tried to explain calmly that livestock cannot just wander around highways and pizza shops, but nobody listened, because Karen started fake crying, yelling, "These animals have been crying out for help every morning, they beg for silence and freedom," and everyone gasped, as if she had delivered a speech written by Shakespeare himself, and then the megaphone warrior group formed a picket line along my fence, chanting while scaring the chickens who ran around flapping because they thought it was feeding time, and their clucks triggered the protesters, who then yelled, "See, they are crying in fear," and Karen pointed at the cows who had just started mooing because it was lunch time, and screamed, "Look at them, calling for justice," and the mob cheered louder, making the animals even more confused, and the noise was so chaotic that even the nearby sheriff showed up to investigate, thinking there must have been a riot, not a farm protest, and when he came over, Karen rushed to him yelling, "Officer, arrest this man, he is a farm tyrant," and the sheriff simply looked at me, looked at the animals peacefully grazing, then looked at her, and sighed the kind of sigh that comes from knowing your career will never be simple as long as a Karen exists in your jurisdiction, and he told the protesters they were trespassing and must leave the property line, and that no laws were being broken by me, but Karen refused to retreat, grabbing the fence like she was trying to shake it down, screaming, "These animals deserve to be free," and suddenly in the midst of all that noise a large thud came from her house, followed by a roar that shook everyone into silence, and Earl whispered, "Please tell me that is not what I think it is," and Karen froze, her face turning into pure panic, because that roar did not belong to any farm creature, but something much more exotic and illegal, and as everyone turned to her backyard, the door of her shed burst open with a metal-tearing crash, and a very familiar striped tail flicked out into the sunlight, and panic snapped the activists into chaos mode, as they screamed, "Wild animal, run," and the giant cat she had illegally owned earlier, clearly not fully relocated due to bureaucratic delays, leaped onto her patio, knocking over her garden flamingos, and letting out a roar so loud that the protesters sprinted away, dropping signs, tripping over each other, as Karen shrieked, save me from the beast, it's not mine, it escaped from his farm, he is framing me again," and she scrambled to climb onto the roof of her house, which only made her look like a frantic cat fleeing another cat, and the sheriff grabbed his radio, calling wildlife control immediately, because nobody wanted that giant predator to run loose into town, and somehow while trying to escape Karen slipped from the edge, and fell right into her inflatable kiddie pool, splashing like a walrus dropped from a helicopter, and Earl whispered, "She really needs to stop falling into things, this is becoming a habit." Meanwhile the tiger paced angrily, as if annoyed by all the screaming, and I grabbed my animals, guiding them carefully inside the barn, because drama is amusing but not when claws and teeth enter the picture, and just in time the wildlife officer arrived yet again with his team equipped with tranquilizers and nets, moving swiftly and calmly, while Karen kept wailing in the kiddie pool, claiming she was just fostering the tiger for a friend, and everyone ignored her because the truth was louder than her lies, and after a tense few minutes the officers professionally subdued the tiger, returning it safely to their transport crate, and as they locked the gate the lead officer turned toward Karen, who was soaked, shivering, and smelling like pool water, and pure regret, and he informed her that this violation alone would escalate her case significantly, and that this time she would not be avoiding real charges, and she tried to crawl out of the pool but slipped into the water again, flailing her arms with dramatic gurgles while yelling. This farm caused all of this, it's cursed, and Earl couldn't hold in his laughter anymore, and I realized that for once Karen's own noise had finally destroyed her lies in front of every witness she manipulated. But of course she wasn't done. No Karen ever accepts defeat, even when dripping wet, surrounded by cops, and proven wrong by a roaring tiger. She threw one last dramatic threat as they helped her to her feet, saying, "Mark my words, this war isn't over. I will rise again, and silence will return to this neighborhood, even if I must take down every single barn to achieve it." And the sheriff told her calmly that rising again would require permission from a judge, considering she was definitely spending some time in custody this round, and I stood there knowing Earl was right earlier. This wasn't just a feud anymore, it was a full-scale absurd battle of survival, and we all knew the final chapter of Karen's chaos was coming soon, and it would be the loudest, craziest showdown this farm had ever witnessed. When Karen was hauled off again after her tiger made a surprise guest appearance, everyone expected peace to finally settle over the farmland like a comfortable blanket, but with a Karen-involved peace is just the pause between two disasters, because even from inside a detention cell she managed to stir chaos by accusing the county of kidnapping her animals and threatening to expose a global farm conspiracy, which made every official in town collectively facepalm, and while she waited for her court hearing she somehow convinced a lawyer to fight for the return of her exotic wildlife, claiming emotional distress and loudly proclaiming animal liberation, but the Wildlife Agency presented enough evidence to crush her case like a tractor rolling over a soda can, and so she came back home, not triumphant in victory but limping with frustration from the humiliation of losing legally, publicly, and loudly, and Earl warned me that her desperation was about to reach a new level, because a Karen who has nothing left to lose becomes a natural disaster with a hairstyle, and he was absolutely right, because the night she returned she turned every single floodlight she owned toward my house, blasting enough brightness to call UFOs down from space, and she screamed at the top of her lungs, "You think you won, but this is my neighborhood, and I will eliminate every last animal noise if it kills me," and Earl muttered she finally said the quiet part out loud, "She wants to eliminate noise by eliminating animals." And we both rushed outside just in time to catch her trying to climb the fence again, but this time she was carrying spray paint and noise cancellation ear covers wrapped around her head like a helmet, and she began spraying big red X marks on my barn, yelling "Condemned, condemned by the order of Karen, the rightful ruler of this land," and Earl shouted, "Stop vandalizing property before we call the sheriff again," and she spun around wildly pointing the can at us like it was a weapon, and yelling, "Try it, I dare you." "I am ready for battle then." In her dramatic exit she tripped over her own floodlight cords and face planted into the dirt, leaving a perfect Karen-shaped imprint, but she scrambled back up without even brushing herself off, then ran to her yard shouting that she had to prepare the ultimate plan, and when she said ultimate plan, Earl and I looked at each other knowing exactly what that meant. She was preparing to escalate from sabotage to destruction, and we were not going to sit back and let her harm a single goat feather or piece of straw, so we set out a new defense system, not military grade, but enough cameras, sensors, and motion-activated sprinklers to make her think twice, and that night didn't disappoint. Around 2 a.m. alarms beeped, and we saw her crawling commando-style across the grass wearing camouflage that was clearly just old green pajamas and dragging something large wrapped in a tarp, and I whispered, "Please do not be a dynamite barrel, please do not be a dynamite barrel," but when she unwrapped it we saw it was a giant industrial speaker, one that probably could shake the earth itself, and she positioned it right against the fence, intending to blast us with what sounded like pre-recorded rooster screams mixed with chainsaw noises, and she tried hooking the speaker to a generator she dragged behind, but the generator cable was too short, so she yanked it repeatedly, yelling, "Cooperate, you mechanical devil," and Earl coughed, trying not to laugh as she plugged it in, poised dramatically to unleash her chaos. But Karma loves comedic timing, because the moment she pressed play the speaker blew up again, sending her flying backward into her own trash cans, and this time the explosion blasted chicken feed all over her yard, which attracted a huge flock of wild birds that swooped down like a feathery tornado surrounding her as she flailed, yelling, "Not the beaks, not the beaks," and we couldn't hold in laughter because she had basically summoned a bird army against herself, and the commotion woke up the entire neighborhood, who came outside filming the spectacle, while Karen screamed, "Get them off me, get them off me," as if she was being attacked by demons instead of hungry pigeons, and the sheriff arrived again shaking his head saying, "Karen, we are tired of seeing your name on every incident report in this county. You are officially banned from stepping onto this farm property line, and any more stunts will turn into a court order that guarantees you will spend the next year behind bars." And the wildlife officer chimed in, stating that if she even thinks about exotic animals again she'll face federal charges, and Karen sat there covered in feathers, trash, and humiliation, realizing she had lost the war, not because she lacked energy, but because every single crazy plan turned against her, and she could blame the world all she wanted, but she was the one who dug this chaotic hole, and then swan dived into it head first, and slowly the floodlights turned off, her yard became dark. once again, and she stomped inside, slamming the door so hard a shingle fell off her roof, and for the first time since she moved in real silence returned not the kind she demanded but the kind she never gave anyone else, and life on the farm flourished. The animals roamed happily. Kenny crowed freely, unbothered by megaphones, lawsuits, or ear-splitting whale noises, and Earl sat with me on the porch, saying who knew salvation would come in the form of birds and broken speakers, and the best feeling of all was the calm we earned. We didn't win by fighting dirty or getting revenge, we won by staying honest, lawful, and patient, until Karen's own actions buried her credibility, and when she finally put up a for sale sign in her yard, after weeks of hiding inside, refusing to show her face, the neighborhood celebrated quietly with lemonade and fresh eggs, everyone thanking us for enduring the madness so they wouldn't have to. And as her moving truck packed up the last of her unlicensed drama props, she shouted one final sentence at the countryside: "This neighborhood never deserved me." Before the door slammed, and the engine roared away, leaving peace behind, and I looked at my farm, the sun rising, the animals greeting a new day, and I smiled, knowing the war of noise had finally ended, not with shock collars or threats, but with a Karen defeated by her own noise. And Earl raised his mug, saying, "Victory tastes better than fresh milk, doesn't it?" And I nodded, thankful that sometimes justice is not loud at all. Sometimes justice is simply the sound of a rooster crowing, and a Karen finally shutting up forever.